All right, welcome to our chapter 3 summary video, and actually it's the beginning of the introduction of the Trilogy of Vitality. And so for the next 3 chapters, I think it's actually 4, we're going to go over the Trilogy of Vitality. So we've got movement, we've got systemic, and we've got mindset. Okay, so let's jump into the first one. Chapter 3 is all about movement. Chapter 3 and 4 actually is movement. And so what we're going to start with here are some of the key pieces to what I introduce here in this chapter, which is the movement paradigm versus the exercise paradigm. So we talked a little bit about the exercise paradigm. And so in this chapter, I introduced the movement paradigm. So we're going to just kind of compare the two so you can start to see the difference between exercise and movement. And so the first thing we talked about with the exercise paradigm was this idea of cadaveric anatomy, how we really base everything in the fitness and traditional rehabilitation space on cadaveric anatomy. And the movement paradigm is anchored into what's called chain reaction biomechanics. Now, chain reaction biomechanics is a term that was created by the Gray Institute. I mentioned that in chapter 3. They were the first people that I ever became aware of, and to this day, I think they're the only ones that really took the time to figure out, well, what is the hamstring doing if it's not flexing the knee? What is the bicep doing? What is the lat doing? What are all the muscles in the body doing if they're not working in this cadaveric way, this cadaveric function? And Gary Gray and Dave Tiberio, who were the founders of the Gray Institute, have done an incredible job on breaking this down and really understanding what is actually going on. That's chain reaction biomechanics. And through studying with Lenny, who I mentioned in the book a lot, Lenny and I took these principles and we started to apply it. We started to figure out, okay, let's take these chain reaction biomechanic principles of how the body moves and what the hamstring's actually doing in the calf and how it's integrated and how the foot actually works with the hip and how the knee is a slave joint because it's just doing with the hip. And I mean, all these incredible concepts. And we started a business together. It was like, all right, man, let's see if we can help people with this principle, understanding chain reaction biomechanics. And to this day, this is one of the anchors that I use when evaluating motion. Okay, but that's the big difference: cadaveric anatomy, chain reaction biomechanics. Exercise paradigm is one-dimensional isolated exercises, right? Like that's how you know you're in the exercise world, where you're isolating and it's a unidimensional movement, okay? Very, very rigid, where one thing's moving, another thing's not. One of the things I see like the exercise world is trying to do is they call it functional movement. And so they do exercises on like balance boards or like on Swiss balls. And it's like, not quite yet, not getting there yet, but because it still isolates a muscle and gets it to squeeze, hold this, squeeze this, don't move that, pull this back, draw this in, keep your knees over your toes. It isolates areas and tries to get them to scream, and they're usually one-dimensional, okay, one-dimensional. Movement paradigm is an integrated three-dimensional movement. It takes into account chain reaction biomechanics, and it teaches the system how to integrate through the chain on how, when I bend over to pick something up, how important the way my right foot hits the ground has everything to do with the ability for me to pick something up with my left hand when I bend over. That's integrated three-dimensional movement that takes into consideration chain reaction biomechanics. Okay, exercise paradigm would do a lunge very differently. It's very rigid, just like the picture in the book. I'm very dumbbells at the side, shoulders back, only move forward, keep your belly button drawn in. That's exercise land. Okay, movement land has you go through a more dynamic flexion, like you're picking something up, and it integrates everything together. Okay, very, very different. So integrated three-dimensional movements. The exercise paradigm is anchored around muscle-specific exercise. So again, it isolates muscles and tries to get them to scream, right? As I said in my book, the guys are, you can't get a bench on Monday because everyone's doing bench press. Got to get those pecs big. You got to grow them, muscle specific. And we're doing bicep curls for the girls, right? Let me do some curls here. And the women in the gym are doing every butt exercise that exists. Like every butt machine. And in the gym I go to, it literally says butt land or something. And it's got every machine there that isolates the glutes to specific exercise to get the butt to grow, to get it to hypertrophy. And again, I'm not saying that these things are, you throw them all out the window, but you got to understand that this is definitely not going to create fluid movement and pain-free movement. It might make you look good in a bathing suit, but it is not going to create a healthy integrated function. And no chance, right? You get away with it when you're younger. It starts to catch up to you later, right? So movement paradigm is anchored around foundational movements. It's anchored around movements of lunging and squatting, pushing, pulling, but movement land, like the movement squat that I introduce in this chapter, how you're letting the spine flex. There isn't these rules about keeping everything super rigid because I have to put a bar on my back and get down. Like, that's all exercise land. And again, I want to keep emphasizing, I'm not saying that these things don't have a place, but we have to understand the place it belongs, okay? Because this is the only thing people are doing, and it should be like a small percentage of what their program looks like, okay? So anchored around foundational movements, very important difference between movement paradigm and exercise paradigm. Exercise paradigm has a lot of rules. That's another reason you can you know you're in exercise land. It's like, move this, don't move that, keep this still, hold this in, knees there, don't move that, push out on the side of your feet, don't make sure your knee. I mean, there's all these rules that usually are a flag that you're in exercise land, because they're trying to control every single part. And by controlling every single part, this idea that I can make everybody work together, but I have to control every part. I got to get the foot to do this. I got to toe it out. I got to make sure it's here, make sure it's there. And it's very rigid. Okay. It's very robotic. And that's what I shared in this chapter. The people that I assessed that moved like robots the most were personal trainers, people that were kind of engulfed in this exercise paradigm. And I was one of those people, man. I mean, I told you the story about when I worked with that construction crew, man. I looked great, but I was useless out there. I mean, I needed a bench press to feel like I was contributing. Toting plywood. I mean, these little guys were running circles around me. They had real strength. They had movement strength. I had exercise strength. Very different. Okay. So this one abides by the rules relative to exercise. This one abides the laws of physics, right? Ground reaction forces, mass, momentum. They're the laws of our environment. Like when we step forward, like what brings us to the ground? Gravity. Okay, great. So what's gravity doing? Oh, gravity's loading my body so I can get back up efficiently. Those are the laws that are applied to movement land. And again, this is very much, again, I learned all these things primarily from Lenny through the Gray Institute. Again, if you're in the field of training and rehabilitation, those are the places I would go to learn these things, okay? But the movement paradigm abides to the laws of physics, how the environment works, okay? And I used to say to myself, no matter who walked into my clinic, I could apply these things to, because they lived on planet Earth. I know that their system worked the same way. Everybody's body muscles work the same, meaning they follow the same laws and principles. Okay, this is why it's so powerful, because if all I have is these 5 exercises to help someone with knee pain, I'm crossing my fingers and hoping that these 5 exercises that I give everybody else who has knee pain, I hope it helps. That's not really understanding what's happening with somebody and understanding what's actually happening when someone's knee hurts. If you've ever worked with me or ever do work with me and you have knee pain, the first question I'm going to ask you is, when does your knee hurt? Because some people are like, oh, it hurts when I'm going on stairs. And so I say, okay, does it hurt when you're going upstairs, or does it hurt when you're going downstairs? Because someone's knee that's hurting when they're going upstairs versus somebody's knee that hurts going downstairs are 2 completely different knee problems. Because what's happening with the physics, gravity, mass, momentum, acceleration, what's happening when you go downstairs, or some people, like, my knee hurts when I'm walking down a hill, Or on a hike up the hill, Matt, like my knee's fine, but when I come down the hill, it hurts. Yeah, because the laws of physics change. The forces acting on the body are completely different when you're going uphill versus downhill, right? That's what movement paradigm looks at. Exercise paradigm, you're getting the same 5 exercises for knee pain because I got the quad, I got the hamstring, I got to strengthen this, I got to stretch that, right? That's exercise paradigm. Movement paradigm, much more complex, much more integrated, and much more much more complicated, right? But also so much more fun because every knee problem is a completely different thing, right? It's kind of fun, right? And then the last thing, exercise paradigm, focuses on contracting and squeezing muscles. This is a big one. You're in exercise land when you're holding and squeezing stuff, right? Like consciously, like squeeze your butt, squeeze it harder, squeeze your bicep, squeeze. No, don't move anything else. Just squeeze. Like the focus in exercise land is contracting. Contraction. And contraction is shortening the muscle, right? Crunchy. Deltoids, right? Chest. Lats. Everything's focused on contracting the muscle, shortening. Okay. That's when you know you're in exercise land. Movement land actually focuses on the exact opposite. Movement land understands that lengthening muscles is what loads them. Like my example of bending over to pick something up, your whole body is lengthening posteriorly, loading by gravity to spring you back up. That's the efficient way. It's the way the body's designed to move. So it focuses on lengthening muscles to load. And so these movement principles, I kind of walk you through, this movement paradigm, that's where the movement principles are created, which we're going to go through next. But I want you guys to understand the difference between movement and exercise. That's a big part of chapter 3 here, is understanding the difference between the movement paradigm and exercise paradigm. And the exercise paradigm, like that graphic in the book, is a small part of this incredibly large movement context. But what we're doing is we're applying this to 95% of the people in every gym and every rehabilitation clinic. We need to shift over here. So that kind of brings us to that statement that I had at my clinic in LA. Exercise is optional, movement is mandatory. And that's where that comes from. This is stuff that you have to be able to do. These are things you could do if you want. Okay. But the movement is mandatory, meaning you need to be able to manage this for your whole life. Okay. Whether you can do bench pressing or whatever it's not a need. It's a want, and it's okay. I'm not saying I don't engage with exercise paradigm stuff at times, but it is the minority of my program. Okay. Because I understand exercise is optional, movement is mandatory. Okay. So let's look at the movement principles here. And I'm going to go through these, relatively quickly, but then I'm going to go out onto the gym floor and I'm going to demonstrate some of this to you guys in actual movement. So we'll just go over them here conceptually quickly, and then I'm going to be out on the floor and I'll walk through these in another way, demonstrate them. So body always follows the path of least resistance. Very important concept here. You'll see how I apply this to stretching. And the example I use in the book is, what happens when we're sitting for a long period of time, then we get up to walk. Why people have back pain and problems is because of this principle. It always follows the path of least resistance. So I'll show you an illustration of that here in a sec. Number 2, the body will sacrifice long-term health to survive in any moment. Another big one. And these guys kind of work together with each other. But I'll give you an example of a young man who's a football player who came to see us because he blew out his knee. I think it was an ACL. Yeah, it was an ACL tear. And we asked him specifically how he tore it. And so I'm going to show you in a second exactly how it happened. And it's a perfect example of this. The body will sacrifice long-term health to survive in any moment. It's a survival machine. And so many different examples of how the body opts for survival over health. And I will show you a couple examples of that, but so important to understand that one. Number 3, Strength and flexibility are relative to the task. I kind of mentioned that before. There's gym strength, and then there's like real world strength. Example in the book is I was really, really strong for the exercises in the gym. That strength didn't carry over to a construction site, as an example. Okay, it made it very hard for me to function on a construction site because the way I was training and what I was asking my body to do were so apart from one another. So I'll show you a couple examples of that. And then number 4, the body moves in 3 dimensions from a micro and macro standpoint. So I'm going to show you a couple examples of that in the book. I'll walk through the example in the book where you're standing and turning and showing you kind of how the body rotates from a macro and a micro standpoint. And then number 5, muscles shorten before lengthening to load, like rubber bands. So I'm going to show you an example of that too. Understanding that it's not about contracting muscles, it's actually about lengthening them. If you're going to throw a baseball as an example, I'm going to lengthen the muscles into my abdominals, my pec, everything lengthens. And then if I do it properly, it's like this giant rubber band that I lengthen. And so now it becomes this whip. And so now I can throw a ball. How am I able to throw a baseball again? Because I learned how to throw. I learned that it's not my arm that's doing it. Exercise Land says, oh, I need to strengthen your rotator cuff. You need to strengthen the muscles in your elbow. Maybe it could be part of it, but what I really needed to learn is how to load through my whole body, how to lengthen properly before unloading the system through my entire kinetic chain. Now we're talking. Now we can learn how to move without being in pain. All right, so let's go on the floor so I can walk you through these things in a more detailed way. All right, so that first movement principle, which is the body always follows the path of least resistance. So I just wanted to demonstrate what you read in the book about kind of sitting to standing. And so when you're sitting down, okay, for a period of time, what you have to understand is that you're in this hip flex position, okay, which means all the muscles in the front of your hip are going to slowly start to adapt to the position you're in, and they're going to adaptively shorten. And if I sit here for a period of time, most people sit probably at least 5 to 7 hours a day. And now that we're in more of a virtual world here, people are probably sitting even more because they don't even have to go to an office and walk around as much. So a lot of sitting going on. And so my body starts to get tight here in the front of the hip. And when it's time to get up, the body is going to follow the path of least resistance. So right now, as I stand up, and as I said in the book, it's like, people make the noise because they're basically working through this area that's gotten tight because it's been sitting. And so in order to walk, like I said in the book, is that this hip, this bone, this femur bone, this has to be able to extend in a perfect world back about 10 degrees. And there's also a rotation that's supposed to happen in the hip that is required to walk properly in a way that doesn't put strain on other body parts. Okay, the hip is supposed to be the primary mover here, right? It's the 500 horsepower engine. So if I'm sitting for a long period of time, my hip gets all tight, and as I get up, this becomes a path of resistance because it's short and tight. So the body says, okay, well, I'm going to follow a path where there's less resistance. And it's 2 choices to walk. I can go into my knee, right? I could start to walk and bend my knee as opposed to extending my hip. Because if this is tight, then my body says, oh, we'll just flex the knee. We'll put the strain in the knee. That's one option. The other option is, oh, I can't get through my hip, so I'll go through my back. So I'll walk with my back. So instead of walking through my hip the way it's supposed to and really power myself forward, instead, the body follows the path of least resistance. And because there's resistance here, it goes into the knee, it goes into the back. And that's what brings me to the second movement principle, which is the body will sacrifice long-term health to survive in any moment. So right now, in this example, it's only concerned with surviving right now. And so that's why it follows the path of least resistance, because it's looking to conserve energy. And so right now, it's more conducive to survival right now if I ask my back or my knee to do the work of my hip, because in this moment, it requires less effort, less energy. In order for me to overpower that, I'd have to kind of, I got to force the hip, and maybe you feel a stretch here and you're like, oh, that's painful. I'm working through tissue that's tight. I'm going through resistance there, which requires energy. And so the body sacrifices long-term health to survive in the moment is because it's not thinking in this moment that if I use my knee and my back or my back instead of my hip, or use them as a hip over time, I'm going to degenerate the knee and I'm going to degenerate the back. It's going to be a problem long-term. It doesn't think long-term. It just thinks right now, it's much more energy efficient for me to ask my knee and or my back to do the job of my hip. And that's a perfect example of how the body will sacrifice long-term health to survive. Now, I mentioned in the previous part about the football player that came in to see us. And I just thought this was so fascinating because he blew out his ACL. And we asked him how. And he very specifically said he was going down the sideline to catch a ball over his right shoulder. And he said he planted his left foot, and he went to turn to catch the ball, and his knee collapsed in and blew out his ACL. It's like, okay, that's relatively common in sports. But if you ask the question, why did the body do that? Why did the body over-rotate an area of the body that's not designed to rotate? We talked about how the knee is a hinge joint, not good at rotating. So why would the body do that? Why would it spin a hinge joint till it snaps, right? Well, when we went into his evaluation and looked into his health history, he actually got into a car accident a long time ago and got a neck injury. And so when we assessed his neck in other areas, he couldn't turn his head to the right very well because he had never been rehabbed properly from a car accident. It was a whiplash. And so if you think about it, right, if I plant my left leg, I need to be able to turn my head here to look back. So I'm getting rotation from my neck here in this case. Obviously, the neck has the ability to rotate as well. But if for some reason I'm compromised in my neck, think about your body's choice. It's like, okay, do I go through this area, risk injuring my neck to catch this ball? Or do I pick up rotation down in the knee? I'd much rather blow out my knee than I would blow out my neck, because I can survive without a knee. I can't survive if I break my neck. Like, these are embedded into our physiology and biology. So I always thought that was a fascinating example of how our body will sacrifice health in the long term to make sure we survive, right? It's like, hey, you don't need a knee, but we definitely need to keep your neck intact. All right. So the next thing I wanted to demonstrate is strength and flexibility are only relative to the task. All right, so we're going to start with flexibility here, and let's talk about this idea that strength and flexibility are only relative to the task. And so I have my yoga mat out here, and this is kind of the classic place where people will stretch. And we'll go through all these different stretches, classic feet out in front of you, reaching to here, to over there, reach that way. And again, I'm not saying that these stretches are bad in themselves, but we need to understand that my ability to do any one of these types of movements, stretches on the ground, yoga positions, poses, it's not, if I can perform that, it doesn't mean I'm flexible. It means I could perform those movements. Because being able to get into this position here and be able to touch my toes doesn't necessarily mean that I'm able to go for a run. Because as you can see here, touching my toes or reaching out over to this way or reaching out that way looks nothing like running, looks nothing like throwing a baseball, looks nothing like picking something up off the floor, right? Now, it doesn't make these things bad, but we have to understand that there's a delta between what I'm doing here and what I want the body to be up to. So the flexibility that you're looking for needs to look like the activities that you're up to. Because if they don't, there's not going to be a correlation. And same with strength. Strength is only led to the test. So same thing. Let's look at some of the classic core exercises, right? Here's one: plank. Hold and squeeze, hold and squeeze, hold and squeeze. Strengthening my core. I got to make my core stronger. Or some of the classic ones I showed in the video is like the dead bug exercises. I need to get my core stronger because my back hurts when I bend over. It's like, well, this core exercise better be one very small part of the program to get you back to bend over to pick something up, if it's even necessary at all. Because again, how does this correlate to being able to bend over and not have my back hurt? It's a big delta there, right? Big gap. And so the big takeaway with this movement principle is to understand that you want to ask the question when you're trying to get more flexible, trying to build strength. Ask the question, what am I specifically trying to get strong for? What am I specifically trying to get flexible for? If it's golf, then your stretches should look like you're playing golf. If it's everyday movements like picking stuff up, lifting stuff over, lifting your arms over your head, then the stretches better look like those actions if you're trying to build flexibility and strength for them. So important. Movement principle number 4 is that the body moves through 3 dimensions, macro and micro. So the 3 dimensions of movement are the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, and the transverse or horizontal plane. So sagittal plane motion is basically forward to back. So me walking towards the camera is sagittal plane. Me walking backwards is a sagittal plane global motion. If I was to shuffle side to side, that's a global frontal plane motion. If I was to stand here and spin around like a top, that's a rotational movement globally. So we can move through these 3 planes of motion at a macro level. Now, where it gets really fun is at a micro level, we can also move in all 3 planes of motion. So the hip, as an example, is a very complicated and dynamic joint because it's a ball and socket joint. So hips can move in the sagittal plane, forward and back. They can move in the frontal plane, side to side, and they can move in the rotational plane. And from a micro standpoint, you can have the femur doing all the motion, sagittal, femur doing all the motion, frontal, femur doing all the motion from the transverse or horizontal plane. You can also create hip motion sagittally with the pelvis. So that same bone is flexing, but my pelvis is rocking over the femur. I can get the frontal plane by tipping my pelvis side to side. And I can get the transverse plane by turning my pelvis, rotating. That would be what would happen in a golf swing, at least we hope, is that you're getting that pelvis to rotate around the femur to load the glutes properly. All right. And so every single joint in your body has an ability to rotate in all 3 planes. So as you remember in the book, the lumbar spine, if you look at the lumbar spine, you'll see those facet joints that I mentioned in the book. Now, those facet joints, if you can notice, they inhibit rotation. So if I try to rotate this, you'll notice that those facet joints hit each other, right? Right there. You can see that right there. As I turn that, they bump into each other. It's not very efficient at rotation, but it still can do it a little bit. It's much more efficient in the frontal plane and much more efficient in the sagittal plane, backwards and forwards, flexion and extension. Okay, not so good in the transverse plane. And as I mentioned in the book, we get into the T-spine, thoracic spine. Those facet joints aren't really there as much, so I can rotate much further. Look at the difference, right? Much easier to rotate in the thoracic spine based on the structure versus the lumbar, right? These are weight-bearing joints. These are very big, strong, hunky joints. Not very good at rotating, very good at going forward and back and side to side. And so every single joint in your body has the ability to go through 3 planes of motion. In the power regions video, I'm going to show you the foot and ankle the hip, and the T-spine, again, to show you why they're power regions. But what we need to understand is any motion you perform, you're moving through a global plane of motion, like walking, for example, is globally sagittal plane. But if you were to look at every joint in the body when you're walking, there is frontal plane, sagittal plane, and transverse plane motion happening at every joint. And a good example of that is if you think about the hips when they walk, you take that left foot and you put it in front of you. If you can see the ball and socket joint, what has to happen in order for me to walk in a sagittal plane global motion is I have to be able to rotate my pelvis around my femur to extend it properly. Okay, and so that's just the simplest example of the intricacy of walking, and how walking is basically a summation of rotation through the entire system in order to do a simple sagittal plane global motion. One example of that with walking is just the pelvis and the rib cage. So when you take a step forward with your left legs in front, right? So I'm stepping forward with my left leg, my pelvis is facing to the right, and my rib cage is facing to the left. So there's this huge rotation through the system when I walk, right? We don't walk with our arms at our side. We walk when our left leg's in front of us, our right arm is in front, and then we step with the right arm, the left arm comes in front. There is all this rotation happening through the entire chain in order to walk straight. Okay, so wickedly intricate, wickedly complex, but super fun to assess. So that's principle number 4, micro and macro 3-dimensional. All right, and the last movement principle is muscles lengthen to load. And so that, I spoke a little bit about this in the previous part of the video, where exercise paradigm focuses on contracting the muscle, shortening the muscle, shortening the muscle, shortening the muscle. Well, movement paradigm understands that we have to lengthen muscles in order to get them to load. And I mentioned that you want to think about muscles like rubber bands. So here's the best example of it. And so if you look at the musculature, you'll notice that the muscle in the back of the body, as you can see from this picture here, their biggest muscles are on the back of the body, and it's almost like it's one giant muscle. So if you look closely, you'll see that you can follow. And so the best way to think about it is to think about one giant muscle that goes from the bottom of your foot all the way to the top of your head. And and there's some practitioners like Thomas Myers who have connected, he calls them fascial anatomy trains, where he has shown that the musculature and fascial system basically function as if they're one giant muscle, like I'm about to demonstrate to you. Anatomy Trains is his book. And so if you think about it, think about one giant muscle that starts at the bottom of my foot, goes all the way up to my head. And when I'm going to bend over to pick something up, like I said in the previous video, gravity's pulling me down, right? And all of these muscles are lengthening as a result of me bending over properly. So my calf, my hamstring, my butt, my spine is flexed, my head's looking down, and every muscle behind me is lengthening, and it brings me back home. Okay? It's the lengthening of these muscles that actually turn them on and produce power. And it's the same example I used with the volleyball player in the beginning of the book, when going up to hit a volleyball smash, right? A spike or throw a ball. The most efficient way to do that is to get all these muscles to lengthen properly, especially the hip. Remember, this is the big powerful muscle, and then it unloads, okay? It's the more efficiently I lengthen this thing through the kinetic chain, the more efficient I will unload, okay? And so you'd never throw a baseball like this, right? Oh, let me contract it. No. Lengthen everything and then unload it. Golf swing is the same thing, right? The more efficient I can sequentially load, and if there's an activity where you need your power regions, Golf is one of them because you need your foot and ankle, you need your hip, and you need your T-spine all rotating at a very high level in order to produce that efficiently, right? Golf is golf and tennis is another one. Huge rotational sports, and if you have any kind of injuries in those, I can almost guarantee one of your power regions, if not a couple of them, are not operating optimally. All right. So principle number 5: muscles lengthen to load. Think of your muscles like rubber band. That's movement paradigm principle number 5. All right, welcome back. The other piece that we covered here in chapter 3 was the power region. So I want to walk through the power regions here and just talk about what they are. But I'm also we're going to go back on the floor here in a second, and I'm going to really show you some examples of how significant the power regions are and these susceptible areas. So the key things to understand about the power regions, which is the foot and ankle complex, the hips, and the thoracic spine, is they are the areas of the body where we get the most amount of gross rotation from. Okay, so we talked about those 3 planes of motion here, which is the sagittal plane, right? Sagittal is forward and back, right? So that's that big slice that's going this way. So sagittal plane motion would be anything that's anterior to the body, curls. Bowing is a sagittal plane motion. Walking towards the camera as I'm walking in the sagittal plane, right? That's sagittal plane. So we can move globally, as I kind of just demonstrated this. We can move globally in the sagittal plane. We can also move in the sagittal plane in each joint. Okay, frontal plane motion is that side to side motion, right? It's if you take your arms and you do a snow angel, that's the frontal plane. So it's anything that happens in this motion here. Okay, and then the horizontal plane, or also called the transverse plane, is the rotation plane. It's where rotation takes place. Okay, and as I said in this chapter, every muscle in the body biases rotation because of its orientation to gravity. Okay, and this is the really key piece that I know could have been a little confusing in the book. So the sagittal plane, and when I lift my arm up straight in front of me, I'm directly opposing gravity. Like gravity's coming down, and I have to go up against gravity to lift my arm up, right? And the way to prove that is if I held something out here, even if it's a 2-pound weight, even just your hand, like if you just hold your hand up here and you hold it up here, at first it's not so bad. But if I said hold this up here for the rest of this video, for the rest of these summary videos, at the end of the videos, you're going to probably have some soreness in your delts, right? Because gravity is pushing you down here. Okay, you have to use your muscle to hold this up because gravity is pushing you down. Okay, so sagittal plane, that happens. Frontal plane, that happens, right? So in this side plane here, gravity is also pushing me down. So it takes my muscle and effort. I have to use energy to lift my arm up because I'm opposing gravity. Okay, the transverse plane is free, right? Like you can do this, and the only thing that is going to stop you is your own bone motion and or your soft tissue tightness. But there's no gravity. Gravity doesn't oppose me here, okay? And because the body is always following the path of least resistance and is always looking to be energy efficient, this system is designed to load itself, lengthen itself in the rotational plane so that it can oppose the planes that oppose gravity, so they can work against. So I load in this free plane. I lengthen without using any energy. I use gravity to lengthen me so that I can oppose gravity. So I'm using gravity to work against gravity, just like the bending over to pick something up. If I let gravity bring me to the ground, it lengthens all these muscles so that I can come back up, right? And it's doing that through rotation from a micro and macro standpoint, okay? Which I was demonstrating a little bit in the last part of the video. And so the foot and ankle, the hips, and the thoracic spine is where our body gets the gross rotation from. So the better these 3 areas are operating and working, the healthier you will be throughout your kinetic chain because the big boys are doing their job, all right? And so the foot and ankle complex, the hips and the T-spine are your power regions because they rotate the most efficiently and most quantitatively, the most amount of rotation from a quantity standpoint. And what's important to understand is the neighboring joints, okay, the knees, the low back, the shoulders, which can very easily turn into neck. These are the areas that are susceptible to them not doing their job, right? So I would say almost every back problem I've ever worked on is not a back problem. But the exercise paradigm has us say, oh, your core is weak, your back needs to be stronger. So we do planks and we do these different dead bug exercises, like I said in the book. And it's like, yeah, no, we got to get out of exercise paradigm. We got to understand how the whole system works, because if the back is cranky and pissed off, it's probably because it's being asked to do something it wasn't designed to do. And I would say that's probably 9 times out of 10, that's what's causing pain anywhere in the body, minus some acute thing that happened, is that area is not designed. Like, I think of the knees and the low back as like 50 horsepower engines, right? And so they're 50 horsepower engines and they're surrounded by these 500 horsepower engines. These areas of the body that are designed to take on this load and transmit it and put it through the system efficiently. But if you shut off one of these bigger engines, then you're asking the 50 horsepower engines to put out 150, sometimes 200 horsepower. The crazy thing about the body is it'll do it for a while. Like your back will function as a hip for a while, right? In the example of sitting down for a long period of time and standing up and getting all that motion out of your back. Like, it'll do it, but it's not sustainable. And eventually it's going to tap out and be like, hey man, that's not my job. I'm not a rotator. Okay. And so these areas, when you have pain in the extremities and in the knees, the first place to look at is to check in and say, are my power regions doing their job? I've rehabilitated elbows and wrists, tennis players' elbows, baseball players' shoulders, and literally have corrected the dysfunction by getting their foot to work better, by making sure their hip's able to load, by making sure their T-spine is able to rotate better. It's almost a guarantee that if someone has use and abuse or chronic like elbow, knee, foot, ankle, plantar fasciitis, or any of these kind of nagging injuries in these areas, it's usually because one of the power regions isn't doing their job. I would say it's almost always the case. All right. And it could be the case where you have all these foot dysfunctions like plantar fasciitis and my foot. That might be because this power region is trying to make up for the fact that the hips are turned off, as an example. So it's not that the power regions themselves can't have problems, but the point is to understand that addressing and looking and understanding that the power regions play such a huge part here in almost every musculoskeletal injury I've ever worked on with anybody, that was being driven biomechanically, right? So we're gonna go out on the floor here, and I'm just gonna walk you through each one of these regions a little specifically using some models, so you can really understand at another level kind of the importance of power regions. And obviously, you've got the power region program, which is another model here, module in this series. And again, you'll be able to understand exactly why I'm having you do the things in the power regions program. So let's go out on the floor. All right, so now we're going to talk about the 3 power regions. All right, and we're going to start with the power region number 1, which is the foot and ankle complex. And if you look at this foot and ankle complex, you will see it is wickedly intricate and complex. As I mentioned, there's 27 bones down here, a series of joints, all kinds of musculature attachments, and it's wickedly complex and intricate. So much happens at this foot and ankle here. And so I just wanted to show you a couple of the things that I mentioned in the book about planes of motion, because we talked about the towel crural joint where we get that dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. So this is me pushing on the gas in my car, right? Pushing on the gas in my car is called plantar flexion. Pulling my foot off the gas is dorsiflexion. And that motion, that sagittal plane motion, comes from what's called the towel crural joint. So that's one of the motions of this foot, but it's actually very small part of what the foot and ankle does. I would say that exercise land focuses mostly on calf stretching by just bringing this bone forward. Well, movement paradigm understands that it's much more intricate than that. And you'll notice that underneath the tibia and fibula, you've got a talus, and then you have the talus that sits on the calcaneus, and it creates this saddle joint. Okay, it's called the subtalar joint, which gives us this motion of side to side. Okay, it allows it to rock. So if you look from the back, my heel, as I rock side to side, I go to the inside of my heel, the outside of the heel, and you'll notice that the heel isn't directly underneath the talus. It's actually off-centered, so that when we hit, we collapse, we come back up. It's a very dynamic joint, super intricate, super complex. And so the combination of this forward and back and this side-to-side action give us this ability. You put them together and we rotate. So I mentioned pronation. When my foot hits the ground, my foot collapses. So this is the right foot. And so as my foot enters the ground, and because of where the calcaneus is, like the heel, when I hit the ground, everybody goes inside. Like the force drives me inward. Okay, that's pronation. Okay, and so when my foot hits the ground, I collapse in. Okay, all of these bones splay. I become that soft platform to a shock absorber. I become a shock absorber. And then when I'm coming to push off, the foot and ankle externally rotates the other direction. Okay, pulls the arch of the foot off, so it goes from going into the ground with the foot, and then it spins out, arch pops up, so I have that stable propeller to push off of. Okay, so I know that's a lot, but I'm giving you a lot so you understand the complexity of this. And so the reason why this is a power region is because we get this incredible amount of rotational capacity down here in the foot. All right, and if you look at why that's important, is because here we got the foot and ankle, and we've got this knee joint, which then brings us up to the hip joint, which I'm going to go through in a second. But the knee is terrible at rotating, right? It's terrible at rotating. That's the ACL injury. So we've got this foot and ankle complex that's wickedly capable of rotating in all these different dimensions it can travel through. And when it's doing its job, the knee doesn't have to do it. But the one thing about the foot and ankle when it comes to knee protection is the hip also has to be doing its job. So let's take a look at the hip. And so as I showed you in the last video, the hip is a ball and socket joint, and it is a huge rotational capacity, massive rotational capacity, whether it's the pelvis moving on the femur or the femur moving on the pelvis. Okay. And so a combination of the hip getting optimal rotation and the foot doing its job to rotate, it makes sure that the knee doesn't have to over rotate. And then we go up the chain to the low back, right? And so we've got a foot that's really good at rotating. We have a knee that's not good at rotating. We have a hip that's really good at rotating. Then we come up the chain. We got the lumbar spine, not good at rotating, like I mentioned. And then we end with the thoracic spine, which I showed you, which is good at rotating. It's the part of the spine that can rotate because the way those vertebral bodies are structured allow for more rotation versus the lumbar spine not made to rotate. So these three power regions are where we get gross rotation from. So hopefully having an idea about this, and I know this stuff is kind of intricate and geeky and biomechanics stuff, and some of you might be way into this, and some of you are like, man, I understood 3% of what you just said. It's okay. The key thing is your foot and ankle, understanding how your foot and ankle has this incredible ability to load and unload the chain and can rotate. The hip has this incredible ability to rotate, and your thoracic spine has this incredible ability to rotate. Just understanding that those are your go-to places when you have aches and pains in the body. And when you engage in the Power Regions program, I just want you to understand, as I take you through all those different exercises and stretches, that this is what we're trying to create. We're trying to optimize rotation in these areas so that the body can work in the most optimal and efficient way.